Hello, my name is Lee Presser. This is my show. I speak frequently to very interesting people. Some of these conversations are so exciting, so intellectually stimulating, I thought others might like to listen in. This is the reason we started recording Conversation with Lee Presser.
Welcome to Conversation with Lee Presser. State Representative Dwight Kay is an old friend to this program. He's here today to speak about the political stalemate at the Illinois State Capitol. It's common knowledge that the state of Illinois is in deep financial trouble. The state budget expired at midnight on June 30th, and yet the state government is still spending even though there's no budget in place to authorize it. This happens because of court orders and continuing appropriations. Illinois continues to pay state employees, make pension payments, finance many social service agencies, and issue various other payments as if it were operating on last year's budget. This is happening while Illinois and Chicago are teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Today we hope Mr. Kay will be able to instruct us as to why Illinois is in a financial mess and what the possible outcome may look like. Dwight Kay, welcome to the conversation.
Good morning.
So this line that I just used about teetering, both Chicago and Illinois itself are teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. I actually stole that from CNBC, a correspondent there named Rick Santelli, who had a guest on, and they were talking about this is several weeks ago. They were talking about Illinois, and they were really fretting about the fact that from a bond point of view, that things look pretty bleak for the state of Illinois. So, why? What has brought the state of Illinois to this place?
Well,
it's not this year's budget or the lack of budget from this year.
I think it's very fair to say that there has been fiscal irresponsibility both in Chicago and in Springfield, the capital of Illinois.
What exactly did that look like, this irresponsibility?
Well, let's take Springfield first. We'll back into Chicago.
Okay.
We haven't had a balanced budget in the state of Illinois since the year 2000, fiscal year 2000.
And we're going into fiscal year 2016.
Correct.
Okay, so you're saying for 16 fiscal years now.
That's correct. And so what that means is that Illinois has spent more money than it's been taking in, and for practical purposes has been unaccountable and irresponsible with the budgets as they've attempted to make, leaving them unbalanced, hoping that tax increases and taxpayers would pick up the tab for the irresponsibility and the lack of accountability within our state. Chicago has a different problem in a sense, although they're a part of Illinois, of course. We had a mayor in Chicago by the name of Daley. In fact, we had two of them. And they were very, very good at borrowing money and rebonding that money. And now we're to the place today with Mayor Emanuel, where he's now capitalizing interest, which means that's the highest level of debt burden you can put on a city or a state.
Now, what does this capitalizing do?
Well, that just means that you have put another layer of borrowing on. You're now borrowing to pay interest, if you will. That's the simple explanation. It's called.
So you still owe the original bonds.
You still owe the original bonds.
And you don't have the money to pay the interest.
That's
so
correct.
Now you got to go out and borrow money just
That's
to
correct.
even pay interest.
That's correct. Now, what people need to understand is that folks in the Metro East and Southern Illinois have property values that are assessed at 33 1/3%. In Chicago, Speaker Madigan has had a plan in place where homeowners in that area only pay 10%, an assessed value of 10%.
This is in place now or a
That's
proposal?
in place today.
Okay.
So no wonder that there's not a little bit of a gap there when you think, here we are, not only is it unfair, but a gap. Here we are at an assessed value on our properties at 1/3. Chicago is 10%.
Of course, Madison County is balanced budget and owes nothing. I mean, they have no debt whatsoever. And so I guess that 33% has been used wisely. How long has this situation in Chicago been going on, and what is the consequence of having only a 10% instead of a 33% evaluation?
Well, obviously, the net of that is simply that in Chicago, Speaker Madigan, as a good example, who may have a $400,000 home, who has an assessed value of 10%, pays far less taxes than somebody in Madison County who has an assessed value on a $400,000 home at 33%. So if you will, there's a good way to look at this practically. Practically speaking, had Chicago not imposed a 10% freeze or cap on their taxes, property taxes, they'd have more money in the bank. Not to say that it would have been used wisely, just more money in the bank. It's no wonder that the Metro East is somewhat better than the city of Chicago because they've had a tax base far higher to work with.
Now, in Chicago, I understand, and you correct me, that they have teacher pensions and they also have city worker pensions that are currently seriously underfunded. Is this correct?
Well, I think that's a fair statement. Others would differ with that, but
what would they say? What would the opponents say?
Here's what they would say. They need temporary relief just to catch up on a short-term basis. I don't agree with that, and here's why. On the 29th of May, a bill came to the House, and basically it was to forgive, for a period of time, this year's pay-in to the Chicago Teachers Pension Plan. And it was a substantial sum of money, somewhere in the neighborhood of $537 million. And the legislature turned it down. It was at the request of Mayor Emanuel. And
interesting, did they turn it down? Or
we turned it down.
But I mean, that was his request?
That was his request.
Okay. Well, who proposed this then, if it wasn't the mayor that wanted
it? Well,
it
came through the Democrat side of the aisle, who proposed the bill. Barbara Flynn Curry carried it on the floor. And interestingly enough, some friends of mine on the Democrat side of the aisle said, no, we're not going to do that. So everyone didn't vote on party lines, but very interesting to that side of the story is that within a day, maybe two, Chicago comes up with $537 million to pay that bill that was due. So you begin to wonder who's fooling who here when it comes to a request, but yet we have the money on hand to pay.
Yeah, my first thought would be, well, what were they going to do with this $500 million if they had got the forgiveness and they had it in the banks or somewhere? They had, I don't know, bank, but they had it somewhere in under a mattress or somewhere.
I don't know. You know, there's a lot of shell games played in Chicago with finances.
Where's the auditor? Where's the state auditor in this?
Well, I'm not sure that we have a state auditor per se. We have an auditor general. I think the auditor general, when asked, does a great job. I know Bill Holland very well, and he's done some audits that I've requested through House resolutions. He turned up the scandal in Southern Illinois prisons where we had workers' compensation claims that were being filed left and right for carpal tunnel claims.
Yes.
He uncovered that scenario, and we finally were able to close that down. So he does a good job when he's asked to. Now, I don't know that he's ever asked to go into Chicago and audit the books.
So, so the state has no, when they suspect there's a problem, they have no means other than you as a legislator to actually pass a bill that causes someone to go there? I mean,
House resolution would cause that. Now,
because like in the state of Missouri, they have an auditor, and you know he or she can busily look at anything that they choose to look at to make sure that all the accounts are square.
Yeah, I'm not sure it works quite the same way in Illinois, and I'll give you a prime example. The College of DuPage up in DuPage County had gross mismanagement within their ranks. The president there has now been fired. I think several other executives have been fired because they simply had money, but they were spending it for personal benefit. At least that's what's been reported. And I think before it's over, that's going to be sort of a legal issue. But in that case, COD, College of DuPage, said, look, Bill Holland, we'd like you to come in here and we'd like you to look at our books. And so he's in the process of doing that now. So I think a request can be made, and if he finds merit in that request for one reason or another, he can do that. He has the authority to do that. But bear in mind, he doesn't do forensic audits, and he has a very limited staff. So what he does is kind of confined to what he's able to do. But in this case, he did go to COD.
Okay. Now, you recently proposed a bill to change the Illinois statutes allowing for Chapter 9 bankruptcies of municipalities, which apparently is not allowed in Illinois right now. Would that not tend to let these bad actors off the hook?
Well, here's where we're headed, and this is my perception. I'm sure that we would get differing views from other parties. But we have raised salaries in the state of Illinois to the point where the taxpayer can't pay for them. And there is a thing called interest arbitration in Illinois where certain unions are able to go to an arbitrator. They can say, we've reached an impasse with the mayor, we've reached an impasse with the county executive, and so they take it to an interest arbitrator. And the interest arbitrator, along with two other people who are selected, I think one's a private a citizen arbitrator, in other words, he's kind of independent, and then we have somebody from the union side who sits and represents the union. But interest arbitrators over the years have failed to do one thing. They fail to look at the ability of the taxpayer to pay for the increases given in salaries. As an example, Rockford, Illinois, the last time an interest arbitrator was involved there was a 7% increase in wages, and they never ever looked at the taxpayer's ability to pay. And I suspect if you talk to Representative Sosnowski from Rockford, he'd say no one ever was asked to consider the taxpayer's ability to pay. So that's kind of how we've gotten ourselves to the point in these municipalities where we can't pay our bills. Now that's just one example. Some mayors have been very aggressive in asking for grants and using grants along with taxpayer dollars to fund things that, in my view, are kind of unnecessary when we're going through a crisis like we are. That's another way you get yourself in a little bit of trouble. But the other thing I'd mention to you is that taxpayers have been subjected, up until the last few years, have been subjected to some pretty hefty property tax increases. And one might ask, with some of the highest property tax rates in the state, why is it that we have problems with some of our municipalities? Maybe not in Madison County, but throughout the state. Because Madison County, although they've raised their rates more often, other counties have done the same thing. So they've had more money in the bank to work with.
Mm-hmm. Now, at the very top of the show, I mentioned that court orders and other means have created a system where they've made the legislature kind of like, why do we need one to pass a budget? Because we're just paying all this money and all these bills anyways without the legislature's approval. So I asked the question, there was and you'll have to tell me specifically what happened because I'll bet you have a closer eye on this, but a judge in St. Clair County made a decision that state workers' pay had to be paid even though there was no budget, because not to do so there would violate a union contract. Is that essentially correct? And why don't you expand on that?
Well, that was his finding. And I'm sure his finding to some degree was based on the fact that that's past practice in Illinois. If you remember, under the Quinn administration, we operated under a pre-existing contract for almost 18 months before a new contract was put in place, ratified, and we moved on with the new contract. This time, it was kind of a political end run because Speaker Madigan decided that that wasn't a good idea. And Lisa Madigan went to the courts, and in fact, I believe she took it all the way up to the Illinois Supreme Court, asking that union workers not be paid. The governor felt that was wrong. I think it was wrong. And so they continue to be paid today because St. Clair County took the lead and said, you must pay them.
Well, the way I'm looking at it, and forgive me if I'm way off base, but it appears to me that, first of all, Illinois only has the money that other people give it. You know, it's not like they're in business and creating wealth of their own. They only get the money that people give them. And what we have here is a judge who's saying, well, these people have to be paid out of a fund for which there is no other source of money, for the most part, other than their friends and neighbors. And the judge is actually ordering friends and neighbors to pay people's wages without the legislature even being involved. That's sort of how it seems to me.
Well, that is true, and he has since we don't have a budget in place, which now we're in September, we have no budget in place, and I think the judge looked at that, and one of the comments I recall in his decision was, not only did he rule in favor of the unions and paying union workers, but he also said you need to go get your budget matters in place. I remind you that our budget, while it has gone over before, and 2006-07 was probably the last year or two that we had problems with it going over into September, most of the time we're done with the budget, albeit unbalanced. We're done with it in May. By the time we adjourn in May, we're done with it. We've worked all summer and we still have no budget.
Okay, so let's get down to it right now. Where in the budget process do we stand exactly?
Okay, well, it's a good question. Again, I would repeat, we have no budget, and so certain appropriation line items are not being paid. As you mentioned, anything that has been set out by a court decree, federally speaking, or has been ordered by a judge, we are paying. Understand that we have $32.6 billion to work with.
Because the tax rates cause money to flow
COGFA,
in.
what
Right.
Government on Forecasting says we're going to receive in 2016.
Right.
So in theory, when that money runs out, when the well goes dry, there's going to be a real problem. That's what happens when you don't have a balanced budget. And I remind you, last year when we passed a budget, that budget was $3.7 billion out of balance. And we passed it, which again brings up a different question. Do we obey the law in Illinois? Because our Constitution says we must have a balanced budget.
I was just going to ask you, isn't there a balanced budget provision in there?
Well, interestingly,
where are the courts operating, or does somebody have to bring a lawsuit?
well, we had a committee of the whole with the Attorney General's office as one of the participants about 2 months ago. And that's the very question I asked. I said, who has standing when an unconstitutional, unbalanced budget is passed? And the Attorney General's office seemed stumped. I said, well, who has standing? Is it you? Well, no. Is it me? Well, we don't know that. Is it any citizen in the state of Illinois? And her response was, Representative, we'll have to get back with you, to which I would say to you, I have not heard a word as of today.
How long ago was this?
2 months ago.
2 months. So nobody. Okay. Well, it would just seem to me, I mean, and I'm no lawyer, I just sit here and ask questions, but it just seems to me that any taxpayer in the state of Illinois should have standing because courts are ordering that taxpayer to fork over monies without a legislative process.
Well, I would tend to agree with you, and it seems to me like whenever we do something that is opposite of what the law requires, that's our Constitution, the Attorney General should be standing up, pounding the desk, not running and hiding and saying, I can't give you an answer. Because as of today, the question I posed 2 months ago hasn't been answered.
I mean, it's not exactly the same, but I seem to recall King George III demanding monies without any legislative action of the colonies back in the starting in the late 1760s and into the 1770s that eventually led people to no taxation without representation. And I thought that's the theory that the United States operated under, including the state of Illinois.
Well, you probably have drawn a correct conclusion. When you have no way in the state of Illinois to rightfully determine what your contingent liabilities are, that's an admission that's been made to me on the House floor. When you have no balance sheet, no income statement, no way to really tell where you're headed financially other than what Moody's predicts, you have a problem. And I say we have a big problem because we don't have general accounting practices in place. And I'm talking about those that are accepted. We have what's called circular accounting, and that means whatever works for today is what's going to work for today.
Okay. Now, as I understand the way the budget process normally works, you have a group of standing committees, and the chairman of these committees get together with the members of the committee, and they try to put together, okay, here's our little amount of money that we're going to need for these particular activities of the state of Illinois. And then all of these chairmen get together, and finally they put it into one big pile, and then they sort it out, and that becomes the budget. Essentially, is that correct?
Well, you're talking about GRF, General Funds Revenue.
Have we even commenced? I mean, we've commenced that process. How far along? Where is the blocking point? How far along have we come to the point where yes or no votes?
Well, we actually had appropriations bills come to the House floor.
And they were voted down?
They were voted down because the bills had no revenue number assigned to them. We have never had a revenue number given to us to use.
Well,
so,
what kind of a budget is that?
Well, it's not a budget. You can't.
What were they voting on then if there wasn't? I thought that's what you vote on.
No.
You don't vote on line
Exactly.
items, you vote on.
You're right. Here's what happened. We had massive spending bills voted on, and they were sent on to the Senate. And they didn't get any further than the Senate because the Senate knew that the governor had already said, I'm going to veto anything that comes to me as a massive spending bill without appropriation, as he rightfully should.
Okay, but back to the question, where is the legislature in this process? I mean, there have been budgets done before in previous years. There is a process, and then eventually this process leads to a document which is put on the governor's desk.
Well,
where is this legislature here? Today is September the 8th. Where is this legislature stand in that process that leads to a budget or a document being put on the governor's desk? Whether he signs it or not is immaterial. But where are we in this process where at least we have something for him to sign or reject?
Well, the General Assembly has not sent him a budget. Now, when I talk about budget, I'm talking about spending as well as revenue. The spending side was already passed and sent on to the Senate with no accompanying revenue. You don't pass a budget that has spending only with no revenue.
Right.
And so my word to my friends across the aisle is, if you're going to do this sort of thing, if this is the kind of antics we're going to play in Illinois, you have the rule of the House and you have the rule of the Senate because you have supermajorities pass a tax increase. You go do it. And that's yet to happen.
Okay. We're down to like 5 minutes left. So let's, excuse me, let's cut to the chase here. You're a businessman. You've been with the Cassins organization for many, many years. You know how a budget works, and you know what happens to companies that don't have a proper budget and don't have proper revenue streams. From your perspective as a business person, what do you anticipate Illinois to be looking like over the next short period of time, and let's just say a longer period of time of 2 or 3 years?
Well, short term, I think we all have to admit that we're penniless. And when I say we're penniless, we do have general revenues coming in, but there's a limit to that. And that's my concern, is that we have passed enormous spending bills and we continue down this road without, we want to spend, but we really don't want to initiate a tax increase, even though it's you know, my friends across the aisle could do that with a supermajority. So short term, it's going to be dismal.
Is that what the Democrats who have the majority in both houses, is that what they want to do? They want to cover these shortages by increasing taxes? Is that what you're saying?
I believe that's the case, but
have they discussed the idea of maybe spending less like a family does?
No. Actually, they're talking about spending more, and those are the very bills that we've been talking about this summer. There are great needs in this state, but if we want to fulfill every line item, so-called need, that's perceived to be within the state of Illinois, then the supermajority is going to have to pass a tax increase. And they're going to have to do their job and send, to make it balanced, they're going to have to send the governor a real budget. And a real budget means revenues and spending.
Mm-hmm. So they've got the revenue side, that's all. They have an idea, and I say they because Republicans seem to have no say in this because of how few Republicans there are in the legislature. Is that right?
Well, yeah, that's exactly right. I
okay,
mean,
so they have to decide. They've already got the spending side set as to what they want, but they haven't figured out where all the revenues are coming to pay for the spending side. Is that what you're saying?
Precisely. In other words, they're going to have to, at this point in time, they're going to have to come up and propose and pass a tax increase some way or another by any potential means out there. They're going to have to pass some kind of tax increase that is about $6 billion annually.
Okay.
Annually.
And that's forever. That's not, I mean, as far as the eye can see.
Unless you want to make cuts.
Right. Now, of course, and we only have a couple minutes here, but let's just look at the other side. There's a lot of old folks. There's a lot of mentally deficient people. There are many young people in this state who have come to depend upon the largesse of the taxpayer. Is that right? And is that what the real holdup here is? And you got about 30 seconds.
Yeah. Well, the real holdup is that there are legitimately needy people, and we need to take care of them. The downside of that very comment is that there are people who pretend to be very needy and without hope unless we help them. And when you get right down to it, if you were to make a determination of those people who are crying for help, some of them really don't need help. And we're not very good at deciphering the real legitimate needy people from those who are not.
That's strange. I thought that we had like a whole series of rules to determine, who has needs and who doesn't.
Well, rules are only as good as the people that are in place to follow them. And I will tell you that the previous administration, Governor Quinn, didn't follow the rules real well.
Thank you very much
You're
for
welcome.
your time today. I've been speaking with State Representative Dwight Kay. He represents the Illinois 112th. It's been quite an interesting discussion about spending and raising revenues for this spending in the state of Illinois. Illinois may be on the verge of bankruptcy here. We're going to upload this to YouTube so you can show it to your friends. Just go to YouTube, Conversation with Lee Presser, and you can see it for yourself. Thank you very much. Next time.